Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada had seen death before. He had witnessed the carnage at Saipan, survived the hell of Tinian, and endured months of relentless American bombardment. But nothing in his 19 years of life, nothing in his rigorous military training, and nothing in the endless propaganda lectures about American weakness had prepared him for what he saw on the morning of February 19, 1945, as he peered through his observation slit in the northern caves of Iwo Jima. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ocean had disappeared. In its place stretched a floating city of steel. Battleships so numerous he stopped counting after 30. Aircraft carriers that seemed to blot out the horizon. Destroyers, cruisers, and transports packed so densely that he could have walked from one to another without touching water. Above this armada, planes circled in formations so vast they darkened the sky like swarms of locusts. The noise was apocalyptic, a sustained roar of engines and explosions that made the volcanic rock beneath his feet tremble continuously. Takeshi's hands shook as he gripped his rifle. Not from fear, though fear was certainly present, but from the sudden, terrible understanding that everything he had been told was a lie. Every confident speech from his officers, every newspaper article about American cowardice, every promise that Japan's divine spirit would overcome material disadvantage. All lies. And in approximately 2 hours, those lies were going to come ashore with a fury that would consume everything on this miserable island of black sand and sulfur. Takeshi Yamada was born in Kyoto in 1926, the second son of a textile merchant whose business had thrived during the early years of Japan's expansion into Manchuria and China. His childhood was comfortable by the standards of the time, filled with traditional festivals, shrine visits, and the rhythmic clatter of his father's looms producing fabric for both civilian and military use. But comfort was not the defining feature of his upbringing. Duty was. From his first day at elementary school, Takeshi learned that he was part of something greater than himself. Japan was not merely a nation, but a divine family, descended from the gods themselves, destined to bring order and civilization to Asia and ultimately the world. His teachers, stern men who had themselves been indoctrinated in the nationalist fervor that had consumed Japan since the Meiji era, taught him that the Western powers, particularly America, were corrupt and decadent. Americans were portrayed as obsessed with material wealth and individual pleasure, lacking the discipline and spiritual purity that Japan strong. They were racially mixed, which Japanese racial theory held as inherently inferior to the homogeneous purity of the Japanese people. Most importantly, Americans were soft. They would never endure the hardships that Japanese soldiers embraced willingly. They would crumble when faced with determined resistance. These lessons were reinforced everywhere. In the movies he watched, where Japanese soldiers invariably defeated larger forces of incompetent foreigners. In the newspapers his father read aloud at breakfast, which reported endless victories and tactical withdrawals that were never called retreats. In the posters plastered on every wall showing muscular Japanese warriors standing triumphant over cowering, hook-nosed caricatures of Americans and British. The message was consistent and pervasive. Japan could not lose, because Japan was spiritually superior, and spiritual superiority would inevitably triumph over mere material advantage. When Takeshi turned 16 in 1942, the war that had begun with such stunning success at Pearl Harbor was still being portrayed as an unbroken string of Japanese victories. The newspapers celebrated the fall of Singapore, the conquest of the Philippines, and the establishment of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. What the papers did not report were the turning points that had already occurred. The disaster at Midway, where Japan lost 4 carriers and the cream of its naval aviators in a single day. The brutal attrition of Guadalcanal, where American industrial might began to reveal itself in the endless stream of supplies and reinforcements that eventually overwhelmed Japanese defenders who fought with increasing desperation as their own supply lines collapsed. Takeshi knew none of this. What he knew was that his country called him to service, and he answered with the enthusiasm of a young man raised to believe that dying for the emperor was the highest honor a Japanese citizen could achieve. He volunteered for the Imperial Japanese Army in March 1943, lying about a minor vision problem that might have disqualified him from service. His father, despite losing his primary labor to military service, expressed nothing but pride. His mother wept but did not protest. This was the natural order of things in wartime Japan. Basic training was conducted at a facility outside Osaka, where Takeshi and 300 other recruits were systematically broken down and rebuilt as instruments of the emperor's will. The training was brutal by design. Soldiers were beaten for minor infractions, subjected to sleep deprivation, and pushed to physical extremes that left some hospitalized and others permanently damaged. The purpose was not merely physical conditioning, but psychological transformation. Individuality was a weakness to be stamped out. Surrender was unthinkable dishonor. Death in service to the emperor was not tragedy, but fulfillment. The training also included extensive indoctrination about the enemy. American soldiers, the instructors explained, were poorly trained conscripts who had no stomach for real combat. They rely on overwhelming firepower because they lacked the courage for close-quarters battle. They surrender readily when cut off from supplies. Most tellingly, they valued their own lives above their duty, a fundamental weakness that Japanese soldiers would exploit ruthlessly. Takeshi absorbed these lessons without question, his faith in Japan's ultimate victory reinforced by every lecture and drill. What neither Takeshi nor his instructors understood was that while they trained with wooden rifles due to steel shortages, American factories were producing firearms at a rate that would eventually arm not just American forces but Allied armies around the globe. While Japanese recruits learned to make do with reduced rations as part of their spiritual training, American soldiers were being fed so well that they often discarded portions of their meals. While Japan's training emphasized individual courage and bayonet charges, America's emphasized combined arms coordination and overwhelming firepower. These were not just different philosophies of war, they were symptoms of entirely different industrial and organizational capacities. By the time Takeshi completed his training in August 1943, Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated dramatically, though this reality was carefully hidden from the public and even from most military personnel outside the highest command levels. The Solomon Islands campaign had become a meat grinder, consuming Japanese troops and aircraft faster than they could be replaced. American submarines were strangling Japan's supply lines, sending thousands of tons of shipping to the bottom every month. Most ominously, American industrial production was reaching levels that Japanese planners had believed impossible. Takeshi's first posting was to a garrison unit in northern Honshu, tedious guard duty that left him restless and eager for real combat. He got his wish in March 1944, when his unit was abruptly transferred to reinforce defenses in the Mariana Islands, where American forces were expected to strike next. The journey itself was revealing, though Takeshi did not recognize the signs at the time. The transport ship was old, poorly maintained, and dangerously overloaded. The voyage took weeks longer due to circuitous routing designed to avoid American submarines. When they finally reached Saipan, Takeshi observed military installations that looked makeshift and undersupplied compared to the robust facilities he had expected. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The attack on Saipan began on June 15, 1944, and for Takeshi, it was an awakening more violent than anything he could have imagined. The preliminary bombardment lasted for days, not hours. Naval gunfire of a volume and accuracy that exceeded anything in his experience systematically dismantled Japanese defensive positions. When the Marines finally came ashore, they came not in scattered, disorganized waves that could be repelled with determined counterattacks, but in coordinated assault formations supported by tanks, artillery, and close air support that seemed omnipresent. Takeshi fought in the hills above the landing beaches, part of a defensive line that was supposed to hold indefinitely through superior Japanese fighting spirit. It held for 3 days before being overwhelmed. What shocked him was not that the Americans were better fighters, though many clearly were, but that they fought with a systematic efficiency that made individual courage almost irrelevant. They identified strong points, called in devastating artillery strikes, and advanced behind walls of fire that left Japanese positions pulverized. When Japanese soldiers charged with fixed bayonets in the desperate banzai attacks that were supposed to break enemy morale, they were cut down by interlocking fields of machine gun fire before they could close to hand-to-hand range. Takeshi survived Saipan by pure chance, knocked unconscious by a near miss from a naval shell, and left for dead by advancing American troops who were too focused on clearing remaining resistance to check every body. He regained consciousness hours later, alone among the dead, and managed to evade capture by hiding in caves until he could link up with other survivors. Of the 31,000 Japanese troops who had defended Saipan, fewer than 1,000 survived to fight again. The rest were dead or captured, and Takeshi had witnessed enough to know that courage alone had not failed them. They had been overwhelmed by an enemy whose material superiority was so vast that spiritual factors became almost meaningless. But the propaganda machine could not admit this truth. When Takeshi and the other Saipan survivors were evacuated to Tinian for reorganization, their officers gave speeches about tactical adjustments and the need for better defensive positions. The fundamental assumption that Japan could still win through superior spirit remained unquestioned, at least publicly. Takeshi, however, had begun to question. The Americans he had fought were not the soft, cowardly figures from the propaganda posters. They were well-fed, superbly equipped, and fought with a professional competence that spoke to training and resources far beyond what he had received. At Tinian, Takeshi experienced the war from the defensive side as American forces landed in late July 1944. The pattern from Saipan repeated with minor variations. Massive preliminary bombardment, overwhelming assault, systematic reduction of defensive positions, Japanese counterattacks that achieved nothing except higher casualty rates. Within 9 days, Tinian was lost. Takeshi survived again, this time by being part of a small group that successfully hid in the island's extensive cave system until they could be evacuated by submarine to the home islands. The submarine ride back to Japan in August 1944 was Takeshi's first extended exposure to other survivors who had fought across the Pacific. The cramped vessel carried soldiers from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, along with a few naval personnel from the disaster in the Philippine Sea, where Japan had lost 3 more carriers and the ability to contest American naval superiority. In whispered conversations that would have been dangerous if overheard by the wrong officers, these men shared their experiences. Every story followed the same pattern: initial confidence, shock at American firepower, desperate resistance, overwhelming defeat. One sergeant, a veteran of Guadalcanal who had somehow survived 2 years of Pacific combat, spoke words that Takeshi would never forget. "We are not losing because our soldiers lack courage. We are losing because the Americans can replace everything we destroy 10 times over, while we struggle to replace anything once. They have more ships, more planes, more tanks, more ammunition, more food, more fuel, more everything. And the gap is not shrinking. It is growing wider every month." These words were seditious, could have resulted in execution if reported, but no one in that submarine contradicted them, because everyone had seen the evidence firsthand. The question that haunted Takeshi during the week-long voyage was not whether Japan could win, a possibility that was becoming harder to believe with each passing day, but why the leadership continued to throw soldiers into battles that could not be won. Was it possible that the generals and admirals didn't understand the true situation? Or did they understand and simply not care about the lives being consumed in a futile effort to delay the inevitable? When Takeshi arrived in Japan in late August 1944, he expected to see signs of crisis, some acknowledgement of the disasters unfolding across the Pacific. Instead, he found the propaganda machine running at full volume, churning out stories of heroic resistance and tactical victories. The newspapers reported that Saipan and Tinian had been evacuated successfully after inflicting unacceptable casualties on the Americans. The loss of the Marianas was portrayed as a minor setback that would be reversed once Japan's secret weapons were deployed. The civilian population, restricted by severe rationing but still largely unaware of how desperate the military situation had become, continued to believe that victory was not just possible but inevitable. Takeshi was given 2 weeks of leave to visit his family in Kyoto before his next assignment. The city looked shabbier than he remembered, with more women and old men visible on the streets and fewer young men. His father's textile business was now producing nothing but military supplies, parachutes and uniforms made from increasingly inferior materials as silk and quality cotton became impossible to obtain. His mother had aged visibly, though she tried to hide her anxiety with forced cheerfulness. His younger sister, now 13, still attended school where she was being trained in bamboo spear tactics to resist the American invasion that everyone knew was coming but no one would openly discuss. During dinner on his second night home, Takeshi's father asked about his experiences in the Pacific. Takeshi began to answer honestly, describing the overwhelming American firepower and the impossible odds Japanese soldiers faced, but stopped when he saw his mother's face go pale. His father, reading the situation, changed the subject quickly. Later that night, his father took him aside and spoke quietly. "I understand that things may be difficult at the front, but your mother and sister need to believe that your service has meaning, that you are part of something that will succeed. Please do not take that faith away from them. They need it to endure what is coming." Takeshi realized then that his father understood, or at least suspected the truth. But even in private, even with his own son, the merchant could not bring himself to speak openly about Japan's impending defeat. The weight of social pressure, the fear of being labeled defeatist or unpatriotic, the sheer momentum of nationalist ideology made honest conversation impossible even within families. This silence, this collective refusal to acknowledge observable reality, would ensure that Japan's suffering continued long past any rational point of surrender. His new assignment came 3 days before his leave ended. Takeshi was to report to a special training facility in Chiba Prefecture, where he would prepare for duty with the 109th Division, recently formed and designated for garrison duty on Iwo Jima. The island meant nothing to him. He had to look it up on a map to understand its location, a tiny speck of volcanic rock halfway between the Marianas and the Japanese home islands. Its strategic importance was obvious once explained. American bombers based in the Marianas were already striking targets in Japan, but the long round trip stretched their fuel capacity and left them vulnerable. Iwo Jima could serve as an emergency landing field for damaged bombers and as a base for fighter escorts that would make American bombing campaigns far more effective. Therefore, the briefing officers explained with grim determination, Iwo Jima must be held at all costs. The island would be fortified extensively. Every cave would become a bunker, every hill a fortress. The Americans would pay such a high price for Iwo Jima that their appetite for further conquest would be broken. This would be the battle that demonstrated the true meaning of Japanese fighting spirit, where spiritual superiority would finally overcome material advantage. Takeshi, along with 200 other soldiers selected for Iwo Jima duty, underwent specialized training in tunnel warfare and cave defense. They learned to construct interconnected bunker systems that could withstand naval bombardment. They practiced emerging from hidden positions to attack, then withdrawing quickly before enemy artillery could respond. They were taught to conserve ammunition, to make every shot count, to kill as many Americans as possible before their own inevitable deaths. Surrender was never mentioned as an option, because surrender was not an option. They were expected to die on Iwo Jima, but they were expected to make the Americans pay a price high enough to justify those deaths. The training was technically excellent, designed by officers who had learned painful lessons from earlier island battles. But it was also built on a fundamental misconception about American psychology. Japanese planners believed that Americans were casualty-averse, that high losses would break their will to continue fighting. This assumption had been reinforced by selective reading of American newspapers and magazines that criticized casualty rates or questioned war strategy. What Japanese intelligence failed to understand was that American democracy's ability to criticize its government during wartime was a strength, not a weakness, and that debate about tactics did not reflect a lack of commitment to victory. Takeshi arrived on Iwo Jima in October 1944 as part of the initial wave of reinforcements that would bring the garrison to over 21,000 men by February 1945. The island was even more desolate than he had imagined. 8 square miles of volcanic rock, black sand, and sulfur deposits that made the air reek constantly. Mount Suribachi, a dormant volcano at the southern tip, dominated the landscape, rising 500 feet above the flat northern plateau. The island had no fresh water, no natural resources, no civilian population, and no reason to exist except as a military position. What Iwo Jima did have was excellent defensive terrain. The volcanic rock, while difficult to dig through, could be carved into elaborate tunnel systems that were nearly impervious to bombardment. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, appointed to command Iwo Jima's defense, was a realist who had spent time in America before the war and understood that Japanese forces could not win through conventional tactics. Instead, he designed a defense in depth that would make the Americans fight for every yard of ground, bleeding them slowly rather than dying gloriously in massed charges that accomplished nothing. Under Kuribayashi's direction, Takeshi and thousands of other soldiers spent 4 months digging. They carved out bunkers 20 feet underground connected by miles of tunnels. They constructed camouflaged pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire. They stockpiled ammunition, food, and water in hidden depots scattered across the island. They placed artillery in caves with multiple firing positions, allowing guns to shoot, relocate, and shoot again before American counter-battery fire could destroy them. It was hard, dirty, dangerous work, with cave ends and sulfur gas killing men regularly. But it was work that gave them hope that perhaps this time, in this place, they might make a difference. During these months of preparation, Takeshi became close to several other soldiers in his unit. There was Corporal Kenji Sato, a farmer's son from Hokkaido whose gentle manner concealed fierce determination. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, a former factory worker from Osaka who could fix any mechanical problem with improvised tools and endless patience. And Sergeant Ichiro Nakamura, their squad leader, a career soldier who had fought in China and Manchuria and treated his men with gruff affection that reminded Takeshi of his father. These friendships, formed in shared hardship and impending doom, became the emotional anchor that would sustain Takeshi through what was coming. They knew the Americans would come eventually. What they did not know was exactly when or in what force. Reconnaissance planes began appearing more frequently in December, photographing every inch of the island despite anti-aircraft fire. In January 1945, the preliminary bombardment began, not the massive fleet bombardment that would precede the invasion, but a systematic campaign of airstrikes and naval shelling designed to soften defenses and destroy anything above ground. The Americans were methodical, patient, clearly in no hurry, which itself spoke to resources so abundant that they could afford to take their time. On February 16th, the bombardment intensified dramatically. For 3 days, battleships and cruisers pounded Iwo Jima with thousands of shells, while aircraft dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. The noise was beyond anything in Takeshi's experience, a sustained roar that made communication impossible and thought difficult. The island shook continuously. Above-ground structures disintegrated. Anything not underground simply ceased to exist. Takeshi and his squad huddled in their bunker 20 feet below the surface, feeling each impact through the volcanic rock, breathing air thick with dust and sulfur fumes, and wondering if the ceiling would collapse and bury them alive. But the bunker held. Kuribayashi's defensive preparations proved their worth, as most of the fortifications survived the preliminary bombardment intact. When the shelling finally paused on the morning of February 19th, Takeshi climbed to his observation position to assess the damage and saw what he would never forget. The impossible armada, the floating city of steel, the physical manifestation of American industrial might that no amount of propaganda could explain away. In that moment, staring at hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft, Takeshi Yamada understood with crystal clarity what many Japanese soldiers would not realize until much later, or perhaps never. Japan had lost this war, not on the battlefield, but in the factories. Not through lack of courage, but through lack of resources. Not because Japanese soldiers were inferior, but because they were being asked to fight an enemy that could lose 10 ships and build 20, that could lose 100 planes and produce 1,000, that could suffer casualties that would cripple Japan and simply bring in fresh divisions that seemed to materialize from an inexhaustible reserve. The lies had been so complete, so pervasive, that seeing the truth felt like physical pain. And the worst part, the part that made Takeshi's hands shake as he gripped his rifle, was knowing that he and 20,000 other men were about to die on this worthless rock, not to win anything, not even to meaningfully delay anything, but simply because the machinery of war, once set in motion, could not be stopped by mere reason or compassion or any sane calculation of cost versus benefit. The Americans would come ashore within hours. The battle would last for weeks, and every man on Iwo Jima, on both sides, was about to pay the price for leaders who had started a war they could not win, and would not end. But that understanding, that moment of clarity as the landing craft began their approach toward the beaches, was only the beginning of Takeshi's education about the true nature of the war. What came next would transform his understanding not just of American industrial capacity, but of the men who wielded it, the system that produced it, and the fundamental differences between the societies locked in this death struggle across the Pacific. The shelling had stopped, the landing craft were in the water, and 21,000 Japanese soldiers prepared to teach the Americans a lesson about the price of conquest, unaware that they themselves were about to receive an education in the mathematics of industrial warfare that no propaganda could have prepared them for. The first wave hit the beaches at 9 in the morning. From his position in a camouflaged bunker halfway up the northern terraces, Takeshi watched through his firing slit as landing craft disgorged their cargo of Marines onto the black volcanic sand. General Kuribayashi had ordered strict fire discipline. Let them land. Let them advance inland. Let them think the bombardment had done its work. Then, when the beaches were crowded with men and equipment, when they were committed and exposed, the hidden guns would open fire and turn the landing zone into a killing ground. Takeshi counted the landing craft. 50 in the first wave, then another 50. Then more and more, until he lost count in the continuous stream of vessels moving from ship to shore and back again in a choreographed dance of amphibious assault. The efficiency was mesmerizing. Each craft knew exactly where to go, when to arrive, how to discharge its cargo, and withdraw to make room for the next wave. There were no collisions, no confusion, just systematic delivery of thousands of men and tons of equipment onto a hostile beach with machine-like precision. For 30 minutes, the Japanese guns remained silent while Marines poured ashore and began pushing inland across the soft volcanic sand that made movement exhausting. Takeshi could see them struggling with the terrain, weighted down with equipment, slipping and sliding on slopes that gave way beneath their boots. Some part of him felt satisfaction at their difficulty. But another part, the part that had been awakened on that submarine ride back from Tinian, recognized that this difficulty was temporary and trivial compared to what was coming. When Kuribayashi finally gave the order to open fire, the island erupted. Artillery pieces hidden in caves across Iwo Jima began dropping shells onto the crowded beaches with devastating accuracy. Machine guns positioned in mutually supporting bunkers created interlocking fields of fire that caught Marines in crossfires they could not escape. Mortars fired from positions the Americans could not see, raining death from above on troops who had nowhere to take cover on the open sand. Takeshi fired his rifle at targets he could barely see through the smoke and dust, following his training to shoot and relocate before American observers could identify his position. Around him, his squad mates did the same. emerging from concealed firing ports to shoot, then withdrawing into the tunnels before return fire could find them. The system worked exactly as designed. Japanese soldiers were inflicting casualties while remaining relatively protected in their underground fortress. But even as the defensive plan proved effective, Takeshi noticed something that filled him with foreboding. The Americans did not break. They did not retreat. They did not panic despite taking heavy casualties on the beaches. Instead, they adapted. Combat engineers began clearing obstacles under fire. Sherman tanks landed and provided mobile firepower that began systematically destroying visible Japanese positions. Naval gunfire shifted from pre-planned bombardment to precision strikes directed by observers on the ground, dropping massive shells on any location that revealed itself by firing. Most tellingly, the Americans kept coming. For every Marine who fell, 2 more took his place. The landing craft never stopped, wave after wave, delivering fresh troops who moved inland with grim determination despite the carnage around them. By noon, thousands of Marines had established a beachhead and were pushing toward the first line of defensive positions despite ferocious resistance. The Japanese were killing Americans at a rate that would have broken most armies Takeshi had ever heard of. But the Americans absorbed these losses and continued advancing. Sergeant Nakamura, crouched beside Takeshi in their bunker during a brief lull in the fighting, spoke what they were both thinking. They should have broken by now. Any rational force would have withdrawn after these casualties. But they just keep coming. How many men do they have? The answer, which neither of them knew but would become horrifyingly clear in the days ahead, was that the Americans had 70,000 Marines and soldiers designated for Iwo Jima, with tens of thousands more in reserve if needed. They could afford to lose hundreds, even thousands, and still maintain overwhelming numerical superiority. They had planned for high casualties and accepted them as the price of victory. This was not reckless disregard for their men's lives, as Japanese propaganda claimed, but cold calculation backed by resources so vast that even expensive victories were sustainable. By nightfall of the first day, the Americans controlled the southern tip of the island, including the beaches, though at a cost of over 2,000 casualties. Japanese casualties were lighter due to their defensive positions, but Takeshi's sector had lost a third of its men to naval gunfire that had finally located and destroyed several bunkers. More critically, ammunition was already running low. The bombardment had destroyed some supply caches, and the intense fighting had consumed stockpiles faster than expected. Resupply was impossible because American control of the beaches had cut off access to the southern supply depots. That night, huddled in the darkness of their bunker with the sounds of American digging and talking filtering through the volcanic rock, Takeshi's squad took inventory of what they had left. 2 days of food if rationed carefully, 3 days of water, ammunition for perhaps 1 more day of heavy fighting, longer if they were selective about targets. Medical supplies were already exhausted after treating the day's wounded, and there was no prospect of resupply because the Americans now sat atop the supply routes. Private Tanaka, the former factory worker, did the mathematics aloud. If we kill 10 Americans for every Japanese soldier lost, which is better than we are doing, we will still lose because they have 3 times as many men as we do. If we destroy 10 American tanks for every Japanese gun destroyed, we will still lose because we have perhaps 50 guns and they landed with over 100 tanks today alone. The numbers do not work in our favor no matter how bravely we fight. Corporal Sato, the farmer's son who clung most tightly to the beliefs they had all been taught, argued back. Numbers are not everything. Our spirit, our willingness to die for the emperor, these give us advantages that cannot be measured. The Americans fight for money and comfort. We fight for something higher. That must count for something. But even as Sato spoke these words, Takeshi heard the doubt creeping into his voice. They had all seen the Marines advancing through fire that should have broken lesser men. They had all watched American tanks absorb hits that would have destroyed Japanese vehicles and keep fighting. They had all observed the systematic, professional way the Americans coordinated infantry, armor, artillery, and air support into a combined arms approach that Japanese forces could not match because they lacked the resources for such integration. On the second day, the Marines began their assault on Mount Suribachi. The extinct volcano was honeycombed with tunnels and fortified positions holding nearly 2,000 Japanese defenders. American commanders knew that Suribachi's height gave Japanese observers perfect views of the beaches, allowing them to direct artillery fire with devastating accuracy. The mountain had to be taken quickly to secure the landing zone. What followed was a microcosm of the entire battle. Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination, emerging from caves to attack with grenades and bayonets, firing from hidden positions until they were killed or buried alive. American forces responded with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and point-blank tank fire, systematically clearing each position no matter how fanatically defended. Progress was measured in yards per hour, each yard purchased with blood from both sides. From his position in the northern defenses, Takeshi could not see the fighting on Suribachi directly, but he could hear it. The constant crash of explosions, the staccato rattle of machine gun fire, the occasional scream that carried across the island when the wind was right. Radio communications from Suribachi's defenders grew increasingly desperate as the Marines closed in, describing situations that were hopeless but from which there could be no withdrawal, because withdrawal meant dishonor. On the fourth day, February 23rd, Suribachi fell. Takeshi watched through binoculars as a small group of Marines reached the summit and raised an American flag. The flag was too small to see clearly from his distance, but its meaning was unmistakable. The symbol of American power now flew over conquered Japanese territory, and there was nothing anyone could do to remove it. Later that day, a larger flag was raised, and this one Takeshi could see clearly. A rectangle of stars and stripes that seemed to mock every promise that Japan's divine mission would prevail. The fall of Suribachi broke something in the Japanese defenders' morale that tactical setbacks had not. The mountain had seemed impregnable, its defenses the model for the entire island's fortification strategy. If Suribachi could fall, despite the determination of its defenders, what hope was there for the rest of Iwo Jima? Yet the orders remained unchanged. Fight to the death. Take as many Americans as possible with you. Make them pay for every inch of this volcanic rock. As the battle moved into its second week, Takeshi's understanding of the Americans continued to evolve in ways that contradicted everything he had been taught. He observed their medical evacuation system, which retrieved wounded Marines from the battlefield with a speed and efficiency that seemed to value every individual life. Japanese wounded were often left where they fell because evacuation was impossible and resources were too scarce for extensive medical care. American wounded were treated as precious assets to be saved whenever possible. He watched their supply system deliver everything from ammunition to hot food to the front lines, despite Japanese fire and the difficult terrain. Japanese defenders were already on half rations, while Americans seemed to have abundance even in the midst of combat. He saw their coordination between air, naval, and ground forces, with aircraft striking targets within hundreds of yards of friendly troops and battleships dropping massive shells on Japanese positions at the direction of forward observers who called in fire with casual precision. Most disturbing was the American treatment of Japanese prisoners. Kuribayashi had ordered that there would be no surrender, and most Japanese soldiers accepted this command. But some, wounded and unable to fight, were captured alive. Takeshi expected these men to be executed or tortured, as Japanese propaganda had always claimed Americans would do. Instead, reports filtered back through the few remaining communication channels that prisoners were being treated for their wounds, given food and water, and held in detention facilities rather than killed. This information was disorienting because it contradicted not just propaganda, but the entire moral framework that justified Japanese actions. If the Americans were not the barbaric enemy that had to be resisted at all costs, if they actually followed the rules of war more carefully than Japanese forces did, then what did that say about the conflict? Who were the barbarians in this equation? By the end of the second week, Takeshi's sector had been reduced to isolated pockets of resistance surrounded by American forces. His original squad of 12 men was down to 5. Sergeant Nakamura had been killed by a flamethrower attack that sealed their primary bunker entrance, forcing the survivors to escape through a narrow auxiliary tunnel that left them trapped in a secondary position with no supply access. They had not eaten in 2 days. Water was nearly gone. Ammunition was down to a few magazines per man. Yet the Americans continued to call for surrender, promising medical treatment and safety to any Japanese soldiers who gave up. The messages were broadcast in Japanese by interpreters, some of whom sounded like they might be ethnic Japanese serving with American forces, which was its own kind of propaganda warfare. The concept that someone of Japanese blood could fight for America challenged the racial ideology that underpinned the entire Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Corporal Sato, wounded in the leg and feverish from infection, argued they should surrender. "We have done our duty. We have killed many Americans. There is no shame in accepting the inevitable when further resistance serves no purpose." But Private Tanaka, surprisingly, opposed this. "If we surrender, we dishonor our families. Our villages will be shamed. Our names will be spoken with contempt. Is saving our bodies worth destroying our spirits?" The debate revealed the trap that Japanese military culture had created. Surrender was defined as the ultimate dishonor, worse than death, a stain that would mark not just the individual but his entire family for generations. This psychological conditioning ensured that Japanese soldiers would fight to the death even when death served no military purpose. It was effective in creating determined resistance, but it also guaranteed that Japan would lose not just the war, but an entire generation of young men who could not bring themselves to choose survival over honor. Takeshi listened to this argument with growing clarity about the fundamental difference between Japanese and American approaches to war. Americans fought to win, and when winning became impossible, they surrendered to fight another day or return home alive. Japanese fought to die gloriously, and when dying became inevitable, they sought death rather than dishonor. One approach preserved human resources for future conflicts. The other consumed them in single-use sacrifice. Over time, across many battles, the cumulative effect of these philosophies was exactly what Takeshi was witnessing on Iwo Jima. On March 10th, 3 weeks into the battle, American forces had secured most of the island and were methodically clearing the remaining Japanese positions in the north. Takeshi's group, now down to 3 men after Sato died of his infected wound, was trapped in a cave system with no escape routes remaining. They had 1 canteen of water between them, no food, and approximately 50 rounds of ammunition total. Outside, they could hear American voices, the rumble of tanks, and the distinctive whoosh of flamethrowers clearing adjacent cave systems. That night, as they waited for the inevitable assault, Sergeant Nakamura's replacement, a young corporal named Yoshida who had survived by pure luck, proposed a final banzai charge. "We cannot win. We cannot escape. But we can die like warriors, taking Americans with us. It is better than sitting in this hole waiting to be burned alive. Or buried." Takeshi considered this proposal and found himself unable to agree. The propaganda answer was yes, glorious death in combat was superior to any alternative. But his experiences since Pearl Harbor, his observations of American power, his growing understanding of the fundamental miscalculations that had led Japan into this war, all these left him unable to embrace death for its own sake. What purpose would be served by killing 1 or 2 more Americans before being killed himself? Would it change the war's outcome? Would it protect Japan? Would it honor the emperor who had sent them to this worthless island to die for no strategic gain? Instead, Takeshi heard himself saying something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "I propose we surrender. We have fought with honor. We have done what was asked of us. There is no dishonor in accepting that we are beaten by an enemy stronger than ourselves. The dishonor lies in the leaders who sent us here to die for nothing." The silence that followed this statement was profound. Takeshi had spoken sedition, criticized the leadership, questioned the sacred obligation to die for the emperor. Under normal circumstances, such words could result in execution by his own comrades. But these were not normal circumstances. Corporal Yoshida and Private Tanaka, both wounded, both exhausted, both having witnessed the same things Takeshi had seen, did not object. Instead, after a long pause, Yoshida simply said, "I agree." The next morning, when American voices called into their cave demanding surrender, Takeshi called back in the limited English he had learned. "We surrender. Do not shoot. 3 soldiers coming out." The Americans sounded surprised, but professional. "Come out slowly. Hands on your heads. No weapons. We will not harm you." Emerging from the cave into the bright sunlight of March 11, 1945, Takeshi experienced a moment of profound dissonance. He had surrendered, committed the ultimate act of dishonor in Japanese military culture, violated every principle he had been taught since childhood. Yet he felt not shame, but relief. The war, for him at least, was over. He had survived, and whatever came next could not be worse than dying in that cave for a cause he no longer believed in. The Marines who took him prisoner were young, probably his own age, and treated him with cautious professionalism rather than cruelty. They searched him for weapons, bound his hands loosely, and provided water, which he drank so greedily that he nearly vomited. They treated the infected cut on his arm with antiseptic that stung, but immediately felt better than the festering wound had for days. And they led him and his 2 companions to a collection area where other Japanese prisoners, perhaps 50 men in total, waited under guard. The collection area was Takeshi's first extended observation of American military logistics up close. A steady stream of trucks moved supplies forward and wounded back. The trucks were new, well-maintained, and so numerous that they seemed to form an unbroken chain. Stacks of ammunition crates, food containers, water cans, and medical supplies sat in organized rows protected by tarps. American soldiers moved with purpose but without the frantic desperation that had characterized Japanese operations in the Pacific. Everything spoke to abundance, organization, and systematic planning. A medical corpsman examined the prisoners, treating wounds and checking for diseases. When he examined Takeshi's emaciated frame, the corpsman made notes and shook his head, speaking to another American in English that Takeshi did not fully understand, but whose tone conveyed concern rather than contempt. Later, a translator arrived, a Japanese-American soldier who spoke perfect Japanese and explained the processing procedure. "You will be taken to Guam for further detention. You will be given food, medical care, and eventually repatriated to Japan after the war. If you cooperate, you will be treated well according to the Geneva Convention." Takeshi asked a question that had been forming since his surrender. How many Americans died taking Iwo Jima? The translator hesitated, then answered honestly. "Current count is over 6,000 dead, nearly 20,000 wounded. This was your costliest battle in the Pacific so far." 6,000 dead, 20,000 wounded, numbers that represented catastrophic losses by Japanese standards, the kind of casualties that would break most armies. Yet the Americans had absorbed these losses and won decisively because they had the resources to sustain such costs. Takeshi thought about the 21,000 Japanese defenders, nearly all dead now, and realized with bitter clarity that both sides had paid hideously for this volcanic rock, but only one side could afford the price. During the flight to Guam on a military transport aircraft, Takeshi observed American servicemen going about their duties with casual efficiency. They ate food from sealed rations that contained more calories than he had seen in days. They read magazines and newspapers from home. They played cards and joked with each other in the easy camaraderie of men who expected to survive the war and return to normal lives. The contrast with Japanese military culture, which emphasized austerity and preparation for death, was stark. At the POW facility on Guam, Takeshi experienced systematic processing that further reinforced his evolving understanding of American capabilities. He was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a prisoner number. He received new clothes to replace his filthy uniform. He was given a full medical examination that identified malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, parasites, and various minor ailments he had considered normal. Treatment began immediately, with medicine, vitamins, and a carefully planned diet designed to restore his health without shocking his shrunken stomach. The food was abundant beyond anything he had experienced since before the war. 3 meals per day, each containing portions that seemed excessive. Meat, vegetables, bread, fruit, and occasional desserts. The Americans fed their prisoners better than Japanese civilians were eating at home, better than Japanese soldiers in the field had eaten for years. This was not generosity, but standard procedure, compliance with international law regarding prisoner treatment. Yet the ease with which Americans maintained these standards while fighting a global war spoke to productive capacity that Japan had never possessed even in peacetime. In the barracks, Takeshi met other Japanese prisoners from Iwo Jima and earlier battles. Some were bitter, clinging to the belief that they had been betrayed by fate or incompetent leadership, but that Japan's cause remained just. Others, like Takeshi, had begun questioning everything they had been taught. These men gathered in quiet conversations after lights out, sharing observations and reaching conclusions that would have been dangerous to speak in Japan, but seemed safe here, where only fellow prisoners could hear. A naval officer who had been captured after his destroyer was sunk near Leyte Gulf spoke about American shipbuilding capacity. They built more vessels in 1944 than our entire combined fleet contained at the start of the war. I have seen intelligence reports. Their production exceeds ours by factors of 10 or 20 depending on the category. We cannot win an industrial war against such capacity. An Army lieutenant from the Philippines campaign described American logistics. They move supplies from America to forward positions 6,000 miles away with greater efficiency than we move supplies from Tokyo to Okinawa. Their trucks, their aircraft, their ships all work together in systems we cannot replicate because we lack the resources and the organizational methods. A pilot who had survived being shot down during the Marianas Turkey shoot shared his perspective on American air power. Their pilots are not as skilled as ours individually, but they have so many aircraft that skill becomes almost irrelevant. They can afford to lose planes and pilots because they produce replacements faster than we can shoot them down. And their new pilots receive far more training than ours because they have fuel to spare for instruction. These conversations, heretical by Japanese standards, were therapeutic for men trying to process trauma and cognitive dissonance. They had fought bravely, often brilliantly, against overwhelming odds. They had not failed as individuals, but they had been sent to fight an unwinnable war by leaders who either did not understand or did not care about the fundamental imbalance between Japanese and American power. Coming to terms with this reality required abandoning deeply held beliefs about Japanese superiority and divine protection. It was painful but necessary for psychological survival. Over the following weeks, as Takeshi regained his health and strength on a diet that would have been considered luxurious in Japan, he received access to information that filled in the larger picture of the war. The Americans allowed prisoners to read selected newspapers and listen to radio broadcasts that provided accurate information about the war's progress. This was partly psychological warfare, demonstrating American transparency and confidence, but it also gave prisoners like Takeshi a comprehensive understanding of just how desperate Japan's situation had become. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 10th, the same day he had surrendered, had killed over 100,000 civilians and destroyed large sections of the city. American B-29 bombers were systematically incinerating Japanese cities with incendiary raids that conventional defenses could not stop. The Japanese mainland was being starved by American submarine warfare that had sunk most of the merchant fleet. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter the war against Japan, and American forces were planning an invasion of the home islands that would make Iwo Jima look like a skirmish. This information devastated many prisoners, but Takeshi found it clarifying. The war was lost. Nothing could change that. The only question was how much more destruction Japan would endure before accepting inevitable defeat. And the answer to that question depended on whether Japanese leadership could abandon the ideology that had led them into this disaster and accept a humiliating but necessary surrender. In late July 1945, Takeshi was among a group of prisoners transferred to a more permanent facility in Hawaii. The voyage across the Pacific on an American transport ship provided yet another revelation about American logistics and organization. The ship was clean, well-maintained, and ran like clockwork. Prisoners were fed regular meals, allowed exercise on deck, and treated with firm but fair discipline. The crew numbered in the hundreds, all performing specialized roles in a complex organization that kept the vessel operating efficiently. Takeshi thought about Japanese transport ships he had sailed on, overcrowded, poorly maintained, operating with skeleton crews because Japan lacked enough trained sailors for its reduced fleet. The contrast was emblematic of the larger differences between the two nations' approaches to war. Americans invested in training, maintenance, logistics, and systems. Japanese relied on spirit, sacrifice, and asking individuals to compensate through superhuman effort for systemic inadequacies. Over time, across thousands of ships and millions of personnel, these different approaches produced the outcome currently unfolding across the Pacific. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, news reached the POW camp through official channels. American officers explained to assembled prisoners that a new weapon of unprecedented power had been used to force Japan's surrender and prevent the need for an invasion that would have cost millions of lives on both sides. The prisoners received this information with mixed reactions. Some refused to believe it, claiming American propaganda. Others wept for their country's suffering. Takeshi felt primarily relief that perhaps now, finally, the war would end before complete national destruction. On August 15th, prisoners listened to a translated broadcast of Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement. The carefully worded speech, with its references to enduring the unendurable and accepting the unacceptable, resonated with Takeshi's own journey from certainty to shock to reluctant acceptance. The emperor cited the atomic weapons as justification for surrender, but Takeshi knew the truth was more complex. Japan had been losing for years. The bombs simply provided political cover for a surrender that rationality had demanded long ago, but that ideology had prevented. In the weeks following the surrender, as arrangements were made for prisoner repatriation, Takeshi reflected on the transformation he had undergone since that morning on Iwo Jima when he had watched the impossible armada approach the beaches. He had arrived on that island believing in Japanese spiritual superiority and American material weakness. He left understanding that spirit without resources was noble but ineffective, and that America's material strength derived not from weakness, but from organizational and industrial systems that Japan had fundamentally misunderstood. The question now was what came next, for him and for Japan. The country would be occupied, probably for years. Its people would need to rebuild from devastation while accepting direction from the former enemy. The ideology that had led to war would need to be dismantled and replaced with something more realistic. And individuals like Takeshi, who had seen both Japanese failure and American capability firsthand, would need to help bridge the gap between conqueror and conquered. As his transport ship approached Yokohama Harbor in October 1945, Takeshi looked out at the ruins of Japanese cities along the coast and thought about the journey ahead. The war had taught him that victory required more than courage and sacrifice. It required productive capacity, organizational efficiency, and most importantly, accurate understanding of reality rather than comfortable illusions. Japan had learned these lessons through catastrophic defeat. Now came the harder task of applying them to build something better from the ashes of imperial ambition. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.